do you really need the data that you're collecting? Or are you just collecting a whole bunch of data that is then going to be a minefield of toxic waste if you get hacked?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, the CyberWire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host, Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
Today, Ben has the story of the IRS backing off on their plans to require facial scans for ID. I have the story of the national security implications of the open data market. And later in the show, my conversation with Patricia Thaine. She's the CEO of Private AI. We're going to be discussing protecting consumer privacy in applications. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. And now, a few thoughts from our sponsors at Arctic Wolf. Arctic Wolf's website gives your organization all the tools that you need to learn where you are on your cybersecurity journey. Learn how Arctic Wolf's platform works in real time, or engage with their content that is specifically customized for your organization. Explore the full Arctic Wolf experience today at arcticwolf.com/cyberwire. At Arctic Wolf, giving you the tools you need is what helps make them the leader in security operations. All right, Ben, let's jump in with some stories here. Why don't you kick things off for us?
So I'm going to do something a little rare today and start with a personal anecdote, but I swear it's going to relate to an actual news story.
All right.
So I got a little slip of paper in the mail probably a month ago telling me how much I got in child tax credits in the tax year of 2021. I have two kids, so it was a nice little amount. Of course, nobody keeps those pieces of paper. And when it was time to actually start doing my taxes, I realized I probably recycled it or it's in a giant pile. So I decided to go to the IRS website, assuming, if I just entered a little bit of personal information, it was probably secure. They could give me that number and I could put it in the right box in TurboTax or whatever.
Yeah.
It turns out to get that information, you have to do a number of, I would say, rather insane things to protect your own personal security. And one of those is to upload your face through a program called ID.me. That's actually the name of the company. Mm-hmm. So the way it works is you upload a photo of your driver's license, and then you take a short 2 to 3 second video on your smartphone and upload that. And using biometric data, they match your face in the recorded video with your driver's license photo. And that is the only way that you can access critical pieces of information that you might need to do your taxes. When seeing that this was the option, I decided to absolutely not do that because of the security concerns. Yeah. And I apparently was not the only one. So I saw an article in the Washington Post entitled, IRS Abandons Facial Recognition Plan After Firestorm of Criticism. So the IRS had bought millions of dollars worth of technology from this company, ID.me, to do this personal verification through biometric data, where somebody submits that video selfie and the driver's license to get access to their tax records. There was a huge backlash, including a letter from our probably the most mentioned United States Senator on our podcast, Ron Wyden, along with 2 dozen other members of Congress of both parties saying, this is absurd. People should not need to submit biometric data in order to get basic information on their tax returns. You can balance trying to secure that data while also not forcing people to do something like upload a video selfie that potentially could present privacy concerns. So the IRS has abandoned that policy. They're going to use different types of authentication going forward. We don't have full details on exactly what that's going to look like. They're going to phase out ID.me. And, we don't really know what's going to happen with the millions of dollars we spent on the software, nor what's going to happen to people who have already submitted their beautiful driver's license photos and video selfies. What's going to happen with that data? So I think this is kind of an apocryphal tale. The technology seemed too good to resist. The IRS had proper motivation. They wanted to protect user data, wanted to make sure that the only people accessing your IRS data, your tax returns. The only person accessing that is you yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it seems like they're admitting that they went a step too far here.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things come to mind here. First of all, obviously, the IRS online website is a huge target for scammers.
For good reason. Yeah, there's a lot of very sensitive information in there.
Right. And of course, people want to try to access, to get your refund. And it's funny, Joe Kerrigan and I were talking about this recently on Hacking Humans. We actually had a listener write in and sent us a copy of a scam that they'd received, a scam attempt. And part of the request of the scammers was both a photo and a video of the person's face, just for this type of thing.
Right. When the scammers are doing it, you know that information is valuable. And that's, I think, reflected in people who actually know what they're talking about on this issue. In this article from the Washington Post, somebody from the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project was quoted as saying, when government agencies use this technology, it's a question of when, not if, this biometric data is hacked, leaked, or misused. The data is so valuable, and there are enough bad actors out there that there is sort of an inevitability behind it.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to, I guess I'll be interested to see what they come up with as their alternative, because I think it's reasonable with something as important as your tax information to require some kind of second factor here. But it's interesting that people found that actual facial scans was a bridge too far.
Yeah, it is always kind of interesting to see what that dividing line is going to be. I mean, we are willing to sacrifice a lot of personal privacy to get access to data. I'm willing to share my location if it tells me where my closest Potbelly sandwich shop is. Even though I know, law enforcement in many circumstances can access that data, and not to mention, data brokers can buy it. But this seems like there's a line that the public and our representatives are just not willing to cross. Now, the interesting question becomes, what happens to all of the other clients of ID.me? 10 federal agencies, including the Social Security Administration, Department of Labor, Veterans Affairs, they at least have purchased contracts with ID.me. And then many states, including the 4 biggest in the country, California, Florida, New York, and Texas, have contracts with ID.me as well. Not to mention, hundreds of private businesses. So, I think it's particularly egregious for the IRS because of the nature of the information the IRS has in its databases. It's very valuable financial information, so the risk is increased. And the IRS has been probably the top government target for hackers since hacking became a thing. Just because of the valuable information there. So it'll be interesting to see whether this sort of starts a trend where ID.me's entire business model collapses, because this just seems like a step too far for people.
Yeah, and I don't know a whole lot about ID.me, so perhaps they have alternatives to just facial recognition that they can provide for people, providing this sort of identity as a service, which it seems as though what they're doing, make it so that someone like a government agency doesn't have to build that in-house, that they can contract it out. I mean, that seems reasonable to me, but like you say, there's a lot of pushback here, and the IRS. I was actually surprised at how quickly the IRS kind of changed their tune on this.
Yeah, usually they're not that responsive. When we complain about other things to the IRS, they're not always.
That's true.
I will say, even beyond the security concerns here, there are some accessibility concerns. So they quoted somebody who lives in our neck of the woods, suburban Maryland, who was told that he had to use ID.me to access his tax records. And he has a disability in his arm, so he needed his daughter's help to run through the process. There are people who don't have cameras on their computers, or who don't have smartphones, or who don't have driver's licenses, or other forms of government-issued IDs, but they still have to produce tax returns, meaning they still need access to IRS data. So even if you stripped all of the security concerns aside, which we are not doing, you still have those accessibility problems. So I just think there have to be better ways, whether that's, standard multi-factor authentication, Obviously, you're going to need a smartphone for that, or other ways. The last 4 digits of your social security number. I think there have to be other methods that are just not as intrusive and not as valuable for potential cyber criminals.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we will have a link to that story. Again, it's from the Washington Post. We'll link to that in the show notes. My story this week comes from the Lawfare blog. This is written by Justin Sherman. He is a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. It's titled The Open Data Market and Risks to National Security. And in this article, Justin Sherman really outlines the case that the fact that the data broker market is wide open, basically unregulated. He points out there are a couple of things that are regulated. There's HIPAA, there's FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. But other than those two things, it's really the Wild West out there when it comes to data gathering, selling data, aggregating data. One of the things that he points out in this article that I think is also noteworthy is this whole notion of inferred data, which you and I have talked about before, where if I know if I have location pings for someone's phone and at night that phone is at my home address and during the day it's at my work address, pretty easy to figure out who that is, right?
Yeah, I think I found Dave Bittner if I have those two pieces of information. Yeah.
But the case that is being made here is that there are actually national security issues here. They point out the cases that got some press about folks in the military and in the intelligence community who, through their things like their Fitbits or their smartphones, things like that, were tracked to locations that were supposed to be secret locations. It's an interesting argument here. What do you make of it, Ben?
Yeah, I think there are national security implications, and we just don't have proper enforcement mechanisms without a federal statute that deals with data privacy. And I think a point he makes in this article is that puts us at a competitive disadvantage with some of our closest competitors. When you have countries, they mentioned Israel and Brazil here, that actually have data privacy regulations, it makes us particularly vulnerable to the Chinas and the Russias of the world if we don't have this system to protect our data. And that certainly makes us vulnerable from a national security perspective. We do have some agencies that have a role in trying to curtail the worst national security risks inherent in data brokerage. So they talk about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which they screen foreign investments in U.S. companies for national security risks. And the dating app Grindr had been obtained by a Chinese firm. And the committee ended up forcing the firm to sell the dating app back to a U.S. company because, as you might expect, there's some very sensitive data being held.
Right.
It's great that this governing agency exists, but they're limited in scope and they're just limited in capabilities. The amount of data that's collected and aggregated by our foreign adversaries that could be used against us in a whole different number of ways that could jeopardize our national security greatly exceeds our organizational capability or our national capability to protect that information. So I think it really does present a significant risk. I think we generally talk about these issues mostly in the domestic context. So when data is being sold to a private firm, how is that firm going to exploit that data in a way that might inhibit your privacy protections? Or is that data going to be sold to a government or law enforcement agency that might be used to arrest you and prosecute you? I think this is a really interesting angle here because a foreign adversary having sensitive information on people in the United States certainly presents major national security risks.
I wonder what legislation like this would look like. I mean, I suppose we could look to some of the other nations who've done this. Obviously, there's, GDPR is the global big stick that's out there. But I guess what I wonder is, are we at the point where these data brokers are such big business that they have been successful at lobbying, at capturing this market, where it's going to be hard to dial them back without shutting them down.
Yeah, I mean, you could do things like ban law enforcement agencies from collecting location data without a warrant. That's been done to a certain extent in the Carpenter decision, but not in all circumstances, particularly when we're talking about shorter-term surveillance. You can institute all different types of federal privacy regulations, but, until we actually enact those, I think we're really in a relatively nebulous area. There are certain state, as we've talked about, regulations of privacy data. We have CCPA. We now have this new law in Virginia, so there's sort of a patchwork. And then there are certain federal statutes where covered entities, like in HIPAA, have to protect that data. But the practice is just not very widespread at this point. And until we get there through data privacy legislation, I just don't think we're going to move forward. And you're right that there is a strong lobby against this. And it's not just big moneyed interests. I mean, we've talked about rank and file individuals, people who don't have a financial stake in this, really enjoy the benefits of sharing their data, having their data sold to data brokers. We get personalized ads on Facebook. We get restaurant recommendations based on our location. These are benefits that we receive. Most people aren't aware that the cost of obtaining these benefits is sharing your sensitive data with a private company. But I do think there would be some pushback, not just from big tech companies, but from consumers, if you had the type of strong federal data privacy regulation that's at issue here, that's recommended in this article.
Yeah, another thing that caught my eye in this article is that they make the case that the executive branch could use the Federal Trade Commission as the enforcer of this sort of thing. Although it's a little, I guess that's part of the issue here is people aren't exactly clear who would be the best lead agency here. You've got representatives, Jamie Raskin, Katie Porter, and evidently 42 other of their colleagues have signed on to a letter to the FTC, and they outlined a few things that they want to see happen. The three they list here are they want to define the sale, transfer, use, or purchase of precise location data collected by an app for purposes other than the essential function of the app. They want to label that as an unfair act or practice. That seems right to me, that if you don't need to collect a piece of data for the actual purpose of the app, then just vacuuming up everybody's data because you convince someone to click on a EULA, that's out of bounds, or should be out of bounds.
Right.
The second one is define app developers' mislabeling of users' location as anonymous as a deceptive practice. You and I have talked many times earlier in this segment about how easy it is to de-anonymize location data, right?
Anonymous, definitely in scare quotes.
Yeah, and then the third one is to enforce its regulations against companies abusing consumers' location data through its penalty authority, so the FTC has the ability to penalize people. It'd be interesting to see if this gains any traction here, but I find it noteworthy that the executive branch, the case they're making in this article is that the president doesn't necessarily have to wait to try to get something through Congress to try to move the needle on this.
Yeah, now that's good. One thing that's mentioned in this article that I think is a really important point is it's not clear that these types of regulations would fall within FTC's jurisdiction. So when we've seen previous enforcement actions against data brokers, these were usually against individuals or companies who were engaging in some type of scam. Using false pretenses, they were able to collect information, whether that was a phishing email or anything else. That's very clearly an unfair or deceptive business act or practice, which would fall under the Federal Trade Commission's authority. It's less clear whether that would be the case if we're talking about a company without, trying to scam you, selling your data to a data broker. So I think Congress could step in and clarify that such regulations like the ones mentioned in this Raskin and Porter bill would fall under FTC's authority. So even though them writing a letter is helpful and, might spur the FTC to action, I think to be on really solid statutory ground, it would be wise for our members of Congress to pass a bill clarifying that the FTC has the power to institute these regulations.
Well, I'm sure it'll happen quickly, Ben, because of how highly functional the U.S. Congress is at this moment.
Yeah, they'll probably pass it in the next 24 hours. Once you have a good idea, bam, committee hearing, done.
You know what? If you and I call our Congress people and just make the request, it'll make its way through just quick as can be, right?
I will say they do listen to phone calls. So if this is something you really care about, now, will they listen to one individual phone call? Maybe not. But if, hundreds of people call about the same issue, that's the one thing that might actually move members of Congress. The problem is, besides you and I, and our listeners, there aren't as many people who are passionate about this as there are about, pick your sexy issue of the day. So,
right.
But that's the one way to get in your member of Congress's ear.
All right. Well, it is an interesting read for sure. Again, that's over on the Lawfare blog. We will have a link to that in the show notes. We would love to hear from you. If you have a story you'd like for us to cover or a question for me or for Ben, you can email us. It's caveat@thecyberwire.com. Let's return to our sponsor, Arctic Wolf. Arctic Wolf is changing the game in ending cyber risk. Arctic Wolf's website has all the tools you need to measure where your organization is at on your security journey. Whether you want to see how Arctic Wolf's model works in real time, take a managed security awareness journey, or calculate how much money your company is spending on alert fatigue, Arctic Wolf's website has it all. Engage with Arctic Wolf's interactive content that either customizes to the unique needs of your business or takes you on a journey to end cyber risk. Explore the full Arctic Wolf experience today at arcticwolf.com/cyberwire. End cyber risk for your organization with Arctic Wolf Security Operations Cloud and Concierge Security Model. Ben, I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Patricia Thaine. She is the CEO of a company called Private AI, and they work on using artificial intelligence to protect consumer privacy and help developers of apps do just that. So, interesting conversation about consumer privacy. Here's Patricia Thaine.
Number one is not understanding what it means to protect consumer privacy in the very first place. Then what it means from a legal perspective, not just from a conceptual understanding. And then trying to figure out, given this, how do we still do what we need to do with the data? How do we still capture what we need to capture? And what kind of tools are available to help us out? So it's a very complex space for people to be playing in, and for developers who have had no background in privacy in their education to start diving into out fresh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about all of the regulations we have around the world and what is truly a global economy online these days. I mean, you think about California's regulations and GDPR. I suspect this is something that is challenging, particularly, as you say, for a newcomer to navigate.
Exactly. So we are seeing mainly managers are the ones who are in charge of deciding whether or not something needs to be privacy preserving and how to go about it, what kind of tools to use. But more and more developers are becoming aware of what it takes to be privacy preserving, and more it's going into their hands. So it's a pretty interesting future that lies ahead for us.
And when you say privacy preserving, how do you define that? What goes into achieving that?
Great question. So it's about a few things. Really core to it is consent. So privacy is really about consent, giving the user the ability to choose what happens with their data, whether or not they can delete it, whether or not they can request for it to be de-identified or anonymized or redacted. It's also about telling the users where the data is going. Are you reselling the data? What kind of processes you're using their data for? Is it actually central to the service that they signed up for? And then another aspect of it that comes up very often in regulations is data minimization. So do you really need the data that you're collecting? Or are you just collecting a whole bunch of data that is then going to be a minefield of toxic waste if you get hacked. And those two are pretty prevalent across the world in the data regulations that are popping up.
It strikes me as you describe those things that it seems like kind of an ideal list of something to aspire to for companies. But I think that there's a lot of folks out there, particularly here in the United States, who feel a little cynical about that. We see so many stories about our data being shared and collected and, EULAs that are too long to read or make sense of and apps vacuuming up as much as they can. Is there a sense that we're in the midst of a transition there, that there's a recognition that we need to make some changes and that more regulation is coming?
More regulation is definitely coming year over year, adaptations to current regulations as well. And there is cynicism. There was cynicism about whether or not we can get technology to catch up the law in this case. Usually we're criticizing the law for not being able to catch up to technology. Now it's the other way around. And in the span of only a few years, we saw some really exciting things happen. For example, companies that had data that were complete messes had to figure out how to organize them. So new innovations started popping up around how to categorize data. Number one issue, what do you have in the troves of data that you collected? And then new companies started popping up around privacy-preserving machine learning, including for federated learning, some really cool open source projects around there as well. New ones about identifying what kind of personal information is associated to a specific individual, because that's a core requirement of data protection regulations like the GDPR. So it is complicated. It's getting less and less complicated as the years go on, and it'll become easier for companies to just be able to dip their toe in the water or their whole leg if that's what they choose to do right off the bat with all of these innovations that are coming forward.
And so the folks that you work with in terms of being able to engage with a company like yours to help them along this journey, how does that interaction work? What are the types of things that they're looking to outsource?
Yes, great question. So we started Private AI because we noticed there was this pretty big gap where it was difficult for developers to integrate privacy into their pipeline. We were specifically thinking of it in terms of NLP teams or teams using AI for unstructured data because the data is really messy. And we were talking to a bunch of folks. We noticed that they were either building tools like ours, which is about data minimization, redacting personally identifiable information from text, images, video, audio. And they had to build this internally or use third-party services that would not get the accuracies that they wanted, or that would also claim rights to their data and then use it for training their own models, which, if you're sharing personal information in the first place, you don't want happening. So we really let users plug in this system that allows them to identify personal information, including direct identifiers and quasi-identifiers for chatbots, for customer service tech, for being able to discover what is in your database in the really messy unstructured data, because a lot of the tools out there are really for structured data. If you look at what happened, for example, at Scatter Labs, which is a Korean chatbot company, they had been collecting billions of chat records that contain sensitive information between lovers. And then they weren't doing anything to protect the privacy of this data as it was being used to train their machine learning models. And the chatbots were spewing out names, usernames, exact addresses of their users. So a solution like ours really helps AI companies avoid that kind of nightmare scenario.
It's something I hadn't really thought about. And boy, it really brings it into focus when you talk about, the chat conversations between lovers. So I was thinking even, with for example, I can imagine somebody in a chat bot with a service provider saying, oh, goodness, I sure hope that I get this up and running. My mother's health has been terrible. She's 78 years old and, she doesn't have much longer. So I hope we can get this going. I mean, that is full of personal information that I suspect the companies don't want to be hanging on to.
Exactly. And a lot of the times companies will say, hey, don't include your personal information in this chat or in this phone call, but people still will, right? They're talking to another human. One thing leads to another, and you're talking about your stay at the hospital the other day. And that's something that is toxic for financial institutions or any organization that's not dealing with healthcare information and doesn't want to know.
I think organizations are more and more used to engaging with other companies who are providing things as a service. And it seems to me like, this is falling right into that, the types of things that you all are providing here. If I'm a developer, I don't have to get bogged down in the privacy elements of the things that I'm developing. Do you suppose that's the shape of things to come, that more and more we're going to see a kind of a granularity here of people relying on third parties to make sure that things like this are properly taken care of?
I sure hope so, because privacy isn't easy. And that has been the case for security for a while. People say don't build your own crypto. It's perfectly valid. Unless you're a team of expert cryptographers, you should not be building your cryptography. These are very complicated problems. Similar to cryptography, where it takes a lot of knowledge, a lot of specialization, and a lot of understanding of where the corner cases are in order to build something that's robust enough to be compliant with the regulations. For now, teams that are building it themselves might get a pass, but if there is a hack, people are going to know what kind of information they were actually collecting and what they were missing with their systems. And there's also always the fact that you're sending this to a third party or making this happen through a third party rather than something that you build internally tends to be a lot more trustworthy as well. You've got that third party stamp of approval.
Can it go both ways, though? I mean, I could imagine that, it's great to have a third party to be able to say that our third party is meeting this standard. But on the other side, I could imagine you probably have customers who come to you and say, hey, this is great. Now prove it. So
it's getting less and less often, but it's still the case that people will want to compare our system to their internal solution or to AWS Comprehend or to a number of systems. And the way that we deal with that is when we have a toolkit that they can just use to compare our system to whatever else is on the market. But it's really about keep track of the regulations. Make sure that you're keeping score of what counts as personal information across the world in these various regions. What does this particular team want? And this requires quite a bit of privacy expertise that a lot of companies are not equipped to handle themselves. So what we find is you'll have internal systems that are built to pick up the basics in pretty basic scenarios like names or, in some cases, regular expressions for credit card numbers. But as soon as you get into something more complicated, like my credit card number is 532, no, wait a second, that's 23. Anything related to natural language gets pretty dicey as soon as you don't have something more complex and robust in place.
I see. Do you suppose we're headed towards a time when this is considered a competitive advantage, that companies are going to be able to raise that flag and say, hey, we're a privacy-first organization, and these are the things we're putting in place to protect you and your information?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. I mean, a lot of privacy-first organizations are showing quite a bit of growth. For example, Brave, DuckDuckGo, and so on. And it's really the privacy that's putting them forward. Is this going to be the case across the board? So what we're seeing is in a lot of businesses is that their customers will actually not give them access to data unless they do something like this that's robust to protect the data. And so the competitive advantage might come from that stamp of approval, that more public stamp of approval, but it might also come just from the access to more data to train your models, for example.
All right, Ben, what do you think?
Really interesting interview. I think, it kind of goes into what we were talking about with the last segment. Some of the coolest features of applications are the very things that might jeopardize consumer privacy. So I think it's becoming part of the culture of these organizations to really weigh those values. Whether you want to have incredibly cool capabilities that allow you to, have a killer app that's going to get lots of downloads on the App Store, or you want to focus on protecting consumer data. Those interests aren't always in conflict, but sometimes they're in conflict. So that's, something that stood out to me.
Yeah. I can also see the real attraction from a developer's point of view of being able to outsource this particular part of your app, and we see this with, people using open source software, and it's my impression that no apps are sort of written from whole cloth anymore. You take a little from here, a little from there, because why reinvent the wheel? But in this case, it seems like, from a regulatory, privacy, convenience, and safety point of view, if you've got someone else who's worrying about that, that's a pretty good value proposition if I'm an app developer.
Absolutely, especially someone who has experience working with a bunch of different app developers, institutions, etc.
Right. All right. Well, again, our thanks to Patricia Thaine from Private AI for joining us. We do appreciate her taking the time. And, of course, we want to thank this week's sponsor, Arctic Wolf. Visit arcticwolf.com/cyberwire, where you can find customized content specific to your organization on your mission to end cyber risk. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. The Caveat podcast is proudly produced in Maryland at the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our senior producer is Jennifer Iben. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpe. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.